Dean of the Faculty of Law at Nazarene University, for inviting me. Permit me also to thank the university administration for accepting to host me and others to discuss a subject that is topical in Kenya today. That is the question of amendments of the Constitution. In order to discuss that subject, one may very well be tempted to go in the route of defining what a constitution is. I will not, because I assume that we know what a constitution is and what it does. Students of law will have been told times without number about a constitution being the Grundnorm, to simply mean that it is the foundational law. And perhaps in defining the Constitution, it is sufficient to say so. It is also important to contextualize the African Constitution in history. Many of you will have read the book written by the Nigerian Adeke Adebayo, written in 2010, The Curse of Berlin, Africa in the post-Cold War situation. In that book, Adebayo says many things, but he traces the problems of the continent of Africa to the Berlin Conference held between the years 1884 and 1885. And in my view, that is significant, because it is out of the Berlin Conference that Africa is partitioned. And what we now know as African countries are divided into spheres of influence, with the leading European powers having their own territories: the Germans, the French, the Portuguese, the British, the Belgians, and the Italians. And the territory that we now refer to as Kenya then becomes a product of the deliberations of the Berlin Conference. It is out of the outcome of the Berlin Conference that the British Settlements Act of 1887 then empowers the British monarch to create laws in such places as they will create settlements, so that the territory that will ultimately become Kenya starts in its embryonic days in those early enactments in 1887. And out of 1887, we come to the East African Protectorate Order in Council of 1897. It is important to look at this history and look at the different epochs which form the foundation stone upon which the process of constitution making begins in earnest in this part of the world. So that when you want to look at the epochs of constitution making in Kenya, or the territory that ultimately becomes Kenya, it can be divided into four distinct epochs. 1897 to 1904 is epoch number one. And during that period, what the British government and the British monarch is interested in is to create a legal infrastructure which will then be the foundation stone upon which the new territories will be created. And the East African Order in Council at that time then comprises what is now Kenya and Uganda, because economically the target was Uganda. And 1897 then sees the legal foundation upon which judicial infrastructure is created, and the office of the commissioner is established, and the commissioner is then clothed with the legal mandate to make laws and to generally administer on the basis of imported law. Law students will be familiar with 1897 as the reception date, and the date during which the reception clause then comes into being. But things are moving very quickly, and in 1902 we have the 1897 Order in Council repealed by the 1902 Order in Council. So that the takeaway during that period is the creation of a legal infrastructure which is meant, as you remember, to support the trade which had been identified as the key engagement by the Imperial British East African Company as early as 1885. The second epoch is between 1905 and 1919. In 1905 and 1919 are critical because the East African Protectorate Order in Council of the year 1905 then makes certain critical changes, one of which is to abolish the office of the commissioner and to replace the office of the commissioner with that of the governor. And you now begin to see administrative structures coming in their embryonic stages. And the landmark happening at that time is the coming into being of the office of the governor. That is the year 1905 and the year 1919. The third epoch is between the year 1920 and the year 1953. And those of you who are familiar with the constitutional history of East Africa will know that the Patents Act of that year then begins to manifest the character of a constitution. Remember, we are still talking about the East African Protectorate. But something happens in the year 1921. And if you look at the Gazette notice at that time of the 7th day of September 1921, you are then able to see that the Kenya Colony Protectorate Order in Council comes into being. And when that happens, we begin to see the formation of what will ultimately become the Republic of Kenya. So the year 1920 and the year 1953 is critical in that we are beginning to see what we now know as the Republic of Kenya. The fourth epoch is between 1954 and 1960. And there are a number of things, but perhaps before I go into that, between 1905 and 1920 and 1953, we begin to see the emergence not only of the executive arm, but we see the legislative arm. And you see the increased representation of Africans and of Indians and of white people between 1920 and 1953. And between 1954 and the year 1960, we have already started seeing the agitation for political independence. And because we are seeing agitation for political independence, a number of critical things are happening. That is when we have the Littleton Constitution, which you'll be familiar with. And in 1958, you have the Lennox-Boyd Constitution. We now begin to see the emergence of constitutions in the manner that we see them. But these constitutions, although they are made by the British Parliament, and one could very well say that in terms of their application in the territory of Kenya, they apply by dint of imperial fiat from the United Kingdom. So the fourth epoch produces two critical documents which are germane to our discussion of amendments of the Constitution: the Littleton Constitution and the Lennox-Boyd Constitution, which brings us to the final phase, leading us to the attainment of political independence, when we have a series of constitutional conferences. And these constitutional conferences are conferences at which the possible independence of Kenya will be discussed. They are held in Whitehall, and they give birth to a constitution which then becomes the Constitution of Independent Kenya, Act number 1968 of 1963, which is then the Constitution of Independent Kenya on the first day of June, the year 1963. These types of constitution are not new. Nigeria has already regained our independence, and they are basically take-away constitutions which are manufactured in England and are referred to as the Westminster Model Constitution. Westminster Model because they have certain features. They talk about the separation of powers, they talk about the executive arm, the legislative arm, the arm. And that becomes our independence constitution in 1963. It is instructive that at that time, the political divide in Kenya is represented by political parties which are on different poles ideologically. The Kenya African National Union, which is the leading political party, is a party that believes that given the character of our nation, which is a multi-ethnic nation, you need a more unitary and centralized government. The Kenya Africa Democratic Union, which from British speak represents the smaller communities which fear the hegemony of the larger tribes, is also supported by colonial settlers. Hegemony will be protected through a federal system. And they carry the day so that the independence constitution is a federal constitution. It is a federal constitution that divides Kenya into 8 regions, creates the office of the Prime Minister, and in many ways it is a constitution which is designed not to be easily amendable, because easy amendability would then expose those who harbor fears from what they then thought would be the diabolical machinations of the larger tribes. But no sooner have we regained independence than the process of the unmaking of the independence constitution begins in earnest. And it begins in earnest because the politicians of the day have succeeded in persuading those who belong to the Kenya African Democratic Union that they can be accommodated. And the very first assault on the Constitution takes place through Act number 28 of 1964. What it does is to create the office of the president. and therefore cuts the umbilical cord between Kenya and the United Kingdom, so that we are now a republic. And it's always very critical when you are looking at the happenings during that period to remember that the things that happened at that time is that KANU, or the Kenya African National Union, succeeds in persuading the leadership of the Kenya African Democratic Union to dissolve their party and to join the Kenya African National Union without loss of office. And it is not only the executive arm of the government that is affected in the manner that I've talked about, it is also the legislature, because up till those amendments, Kenya had a bicameral parliament, complete with the House of Representatives and with the Senate. That also is abolished. These amendments are so far-reaching that you have assaulted the executive arm of government, you have assaulted the legislative arm of government, and you are going to assault what are loosely defined as the architecture that undergirded the very configuration of the Kenyan state. That is the Majimbo system. That is also eliminated. The regions are eliminated, and they are replaced with a provincial administration, which is then controlled from Nairobi, from the office of the president. The judiciary is also assaulted. What you see, therefore, between 1964 and 1969 is the very same thing that the politicians wanted to do through the BBI. It is not an amendment of the Constitution, it's a total dismemberment of the Constitution. That is what happens between 1964 and 1969. In fact, the DNA of the Kenyan Constitution changes so dramatically that in 1969, through Act number 5 of that year, the Kenyan Constitution is reorganized and reissued as the new Constitution via Act number 5 of 1969. That is the history of the process of assault on the Constitution. The 1969 Constitution is what sometimes, for those who are unschooled about constitutional law, is what they refer to as the Independence Constitution. It is not. It is the product of that process of amendments taking place between 1964 and 1969. And remember, at that time, something is also happening within the continent which we must never ignore. It is at the height of the Cold War, so that ideologically, African countries are also gravitating towards different political hegemons. The two hegemons at that time are the Soviet Union and the United States of America, with Europe fundamentally being a lapdog, doing the bidding of the United States of America in many ways. And at that time, constitutional dispensations are not a focus. You'll see countries that gravitate towards communism have constitutions that mirror the Soviet Constitution of 1907. And you'll see such constitutions through the MPLA, or Constitution Mouvement Populaire in Zaire of Mobutu Sese Seko. You'll see that in Angola through the Constitution of Angola as articulated by Agostinho Neto. You see that later, a little later in Ethiopia through the Constitution of the Deg regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam. And you see another set of constitutions which Nwabweze then writes about, and I urge the students here to familiarize themselves with the work of Benjamin Nwabweze. He writes a book in 1973, Constitutionalism in Emergent States. And a year later, in 1974, he writes another book, Presidentialism, which it talks about the character of the presidency in in the Commonwealth countries. And I introduce this ideological divide because constitutions then are not things that we refer to as tools of governance. Governance in most African countries is very personalized. We see the personalization of rules. At that time, you see in Tanzania, for example, in 1967 through the Arusha Declaration, we are talking about one-party states, and the constitutions are mirroring that. In Malawi, we see the one-party state. In Zambia, we see the one-party state. In Uganda, through the avenue of the Common Man's Charter, we see the one-party state. Kenya at that time does not introduce a de jure one-party state, but is a de facto one-party state. And this de facto status is converted into a de jure status by the amendment of the introduction of Section 2A in the year 1982. And that is when the agitation for amendments as we now know them begin to take root. The philosophical explanation for the emergence of these one-party state constitutions is that we are so dangerously diverse that if we allowed multi-party states, it would divide the countries, and we need strong arm measures, centralize power in a manner that will protect us from the vagaries of multiple political parties. In Kenya, therefore, we become a de jure one-party state in 1982, and thereafter we see, you look at the concatenation of events leading up to having a political party that is overbearing, so overbearing that in 1988 we see the change in the voting pattern, which then undermines all written and unwritten democratic principles. And the president of the day then is forced to appoint a commission which was headed by the then Vice President George Saitoti. It is the Saitoti Commission that goes round the country and gathers information, one of which, and is never spoken about as loudly as it should be, that we should have a new constitutional dispensation. A few amendments, a few changes are made, but nothing much happens. So that we go into our election in 1992 when the agitators of the day are saying no elections without constitutional change. But we go to elections regardless because they have been cajoled, some say persuaded, some say enticed. But be that as it may, they are entrapped into this political mesh that has been woven by the Kanu regime, and we go into an election without a new constitutional dispensation. We then go into an election now when there has been an amendment of the Constitution. And what it does is that it simply removes Section 2A, and we go into an election which is said to be a multi-party election, but the infrastructure is one that still supports the single-party state. And when the opposition loses the election, they now recognize that these cosmetic changes are not going to be useful, that we need not only amendments to the Constitution, but we need a new Constitution. You can now begin to see that I'm introducing the word amendment, because amendment from where I sit must be understood to mean an incremental organic change of the Constitution that does not undermine that Constitution or change its fundamental philosophy. That is what an amendment does. When you go beyond that, you are no longer amending the Constitution, you are dismembering the Constitution. We go into the elections in the year 1997, and once again, we do so on the promise that the Constitution will be amended. And that is what leads us to the process of the commencement of the review of the Constitution, when Parliament now enacts a piece of legislation, the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission Act. That Constitution of Kenya Review Commission Act is one that is designed to involve the people in the making of their constitution. Initially, there is a parliamentary process which is commenced by Parliament and which creates several organs of that particular process. It creates an organ which is the Secretariat called the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission. It creates another organ which is called the National Constitutional Conference. It creates another organ which would be Parliament sitting as a body sui generis for purposes of enacting the Constitution, sitting as if it were a constituent assembly. But that process is torpedoed for a number of months when the people of Kenya take the view that a parliamentary-led process will be one that is controlled by the executive, and they start their own process known as the people's process. Ultimately, this process emerged, and we now have a constitutional review process complete with 29 commissioners, complete with a provision for collecting views from every part of the Republic of Kenya, complete with the National Constitutional Conference, and complete with a National Assembly, which, as I've said, will sit as a constituent assembly. And I had the honor and privilege of serving as the CEO of that particular exercise. And we traversed this country. You've got to look at the issues and questions that we asked. And no portion of the Constitution was sacred, because we were not amending the Constitution. Kenyans were now arguing that the Constitution that we made, that we received from the British in 1963 via Act number 1968 of 1963, was, and as reenacted again in 1969, was not a homegrown constitution. We needed to give unto ourselves an autonomous constitution, a homegrown constitution. What we are doing, therefore, between the year 2001 and 2005 is an exercise in making a constitution, a people-driven, people-centered constitution. And when we did that, as I've already said, no provision was sacred. If you look at the foundational documents, we looked at the executive arm of government. We asked ourselves and engaged with the people of Kenya, what kind of executive do you want? What kind of legislature do you want? What kind of judiciary do you want? What kind of issues do you want to deal with human rights? What constitutional bodies do you want? How do you want to deal with the question of human rights? How do you want to deal with the question of affirmative action? How do you want to deal with the question of land and the historical injustices that have visited the Republic of Kenya since she regained her political independence? And when you look at the Constitution, all those issues are issues which are dealt with. How do you want to deal with the amendment of your Constitution? And that becomes a very important issue, because it was recognized that the short history of Kenya had demonstrated that whenever the political class wanted to have short gains in their political schemes, they amended the Constitution. And that is what prompted my teacher, the late Professor Hastings Wilfred Opinyo Kothogendo, to write his famous article, Constitutions Without Constitutionalism, in 1972, because he was observing a trend in Africa where constitutions exist. Africa was a forest of beautiful constitutions, but a graveyard of non-constitutional behavior. And he writes that article in 1972. And we are therefore saying, as we make our constitution, we want a constitution that will be immunized from the machinations of the acrobatic politician. And we do so that when we are about to enact the Constitution, I remember this so very clearly. It was the 30th day of April, the year 2004. We are sitting at the National Constitutional Conference. We are about to take the product of the National Constitutional Conference to Parliament, but somebody goes to court in the famous Njoya case. And in that case, he argues, and he did so successfully, that it cannot be right that we are making a constitution, and we are saying that that constitution, when it has come from the conference, then it goes to Parliament, which sits as a constituent assembly, then it becomes the Constitution of the Republic of Kenya. He argues before Ingera J, as he then was, that there is something called the constituent power, and that constituent power resides and reposes in the people, and that they can only express it through the instrumentality of a referendum. The finding is then made that whatever product we have at the National Constitutional Conference must be taken to the people to a referendum, and that referendum must be one that is held upon a threshold that deals with the matter in a manner that will demonstrate that the people of Kenya, in their majority, have spoken unequivocally. It is on the basis of that law that in the year 2005, we then subject the product not of the bombers of Kenya. It must be remembered. The product of the bombers of Kenya is not what was taken to the referendum. What was taken to the referendum was a document which was produced at Kilifi by politicians who had once again dismembered it and denied it of its coherence. And when it is taken to the referendum in the year 2005, it fails, and we find ourselves in that year without a new constitution. So we go once again to the elections in the year 2007 without a new constitution, and the president of the day, or the candidate of the day, Mwai Kibaki, then says, within 100 days of my presidency, we shall have a new constitution. You and me know that that did not happen. And we then go into the elections in the year 2000, and we have the clashes, and the motivation for a new constitutional dispensation is now very clear. In fact, it is not lost on me that when we were making the Constitution, that there were those who used to say that you cannot have a new Constitution unless there is a crisis. And the year 2007, 2008 poses existential threat to the Kenyan nation as we do it, and as one of the settlement issues of Agenda 4, the 4 settlement issues, one of the things that we say we must have is a new constitutional dispensation, which we then, of course, produce and becomes the Constitution of Kenya 2010, with a lot of it borrowed from the Boma's draft, but a lot of it also excluded. And be that as it may, we do have a Constitution of Kenya 2010, which has a preamble that says, among other things, that we have given ourselves that constitution. That we have given ourselves a constitution which we have created for ourselves. That constitution is mindful of the history that I have narrated synoptically. And it therefore deals with the question of amendments quite pointedly at Article 255. It tells you that this constitution can be amended. But when you are amending it, there are different avenues. And there are certain aspects of this Constitution which enjoy special protection. There are certain provisions of this Constitution which form what I will now say is its basic structure, because that is the skeleton upon which the flesh rests. Those issues are listed in Article 255. When you want to change them, you've got to follow a long journey and a long avenue. You must go back to the people of Kenya. So that what we call the basic structure is no longer something, a pie in the sky. No, it is not. It is no longer something that we look for in the dark. No. It is something in my submission which is subject to contradiction, that we have now pulled down and placed in the Constitution by giving a special avenue for its amendments. The Constitution now tells you that when you want to amend me, I give unto you two avenues. Avenue number one, because we have said that we are a democracy, that there are certain powers that we will exercise directly, and there are others that we will exercise indirectly through our elected leaders. Avenue number one, there are provisions of our Constitution which our representatives, who in theory speak for us, can amend, and they can follow avenue number 256, Article 256. But there is another avenue which is not available to the legislators. It is not available to the president qua president, because he is a citizen of the Republic of Kenya, but when he becomes the president, he occupies a pedestal which diminishes his powers to the extent that he can participate in the process of constitutional amendment. That avenue is to be found in Article number 257, is the popular initiative. So that Kenya is now clear about how to amend her constitution. You know, a little earlier, I remember when we were making our constitution, the late Professor Ali Mazurui, in the year 2001, when asked how should we make our constitution, and he wrote a paper which I commend to all of you. The title of the paper was, "If African politics is ethnic prone, can we make constitutions that are ethnic proof?" And the thesis in that paper is what informed some of the things that you find in our Constitution. We were aware of our diversity, and we were trying to create a constitutional dispensation that would be alive to our diversity, but also alive to our unity in that diversity. So we can amend our Constitution. So the Constitution tells us how we can amend our Constitution in accordance with that Constitution. So our history tells us that when you want to amend that Constitution, there is a procedure. It tells us that if you want to amend the Constitution in the manner that we saw being attempted via the BBI, that you then follow the path that is known as the popular initiative. And it is contemplated that it is the ordinary citizen, and I'm using these words guardedly and also deliberately, who will initiate the process. Let us go back a little and now introduce the BBI. The BBI is marketed as an enlightened attempt by the President of the Republic and the titular head of the opposition to unite the country, And they take the view that in order to do that, the Constitution of Kenya should be amended. They then agree in the shadows that they shall put together a task force which shall be christened the Building Bridges Initiative and a task force to boot. That body is then given a veneer of legal or a veneer of legitimacy through a gazette notice. In other words, the body is created by presidential fiat. That is where the rain begins to beat them. Because if you look at the previous history of constitution making, in order to create a legitimate body, Parliament sat and created the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission and told us how its members would be chosen. It told us the qualification of those members. It told us how it would expend public taxes. It told us that the budget of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission would be a charge on the consolidated fund of this BBI created by presidential fiat. It does not tell us how we will compose it, what the qualifications of its members will be. It doesn't tell us how they will be funded, but funded they were. And once they have been funded and they go out, they walk, they claim across the Republic of Kenya. I did not see them in their splendor. I heard about them. But they came up with a bill. And that bill seeks to touch at least 74 articles of the Constitution. And they said that that would be an amendment of the Constitution. That even, no matter how elastic the meaning of the word amendment is, that cannot possibly be true. And that is why what was sought to be done through the BBI qualifies in constitutional talk, not as a constitutional amendment, but as a constitutional dismemberment. And it becomes a constitutional dismemberment because if it were to be effected, it would change the character and the theory and the philosophical character of the Constitution. You note, among other things, that it touches the executive arm of the government. The Kenyan system is fundamentally a presidential system, give and take, because there's no one-size-fits-all presidential system. What it seeks to do is to create something which is a hybrid between a presidential system and a parliamentary system. Remember that one of its desires was to create the office of the Prime Minister, the office of the Deputy Prime Minister, 2 Deputy Prime Ministers, and it did not stop there. It was also going to affect the legislature. It did not stop there. It was also going to affect the judiciary. So, in a nutshell, what we see is that Kenya, as we know it, has had a history of amending the Constitution. But the attempt at constitutional amendment, which is now on the table now via BBI, would have been precedent-setting. And those of you who have had the advantage of reading the judgment of the Court of the High Court, the judgment of the Supreme Court, the judgment of the Court of Appeal, and the judgment of the Supreme Court, must now agree that whatever mistakes may have been made by different tiers of court, they are unanimous in recognizing that the mode of amendment of the Constitution, once provided for in the Constitution, must be followed with the delicacy of a sleepwalker. Once, and as you read the Constitution, as you read the judgment, you'll be able to see a number of things which perhaps will raise your eyebrows, and as students of law, you'll have occasion to engage some of these issues. But I want to give my own comments and my own assessment of what I consider to have emerged very prominently in the judgment of the BBI. A few things that I thought that the Supreme Court would deal with very quickly was the question of the quorum at the IEBC. I thought that that would not stand, because if they were to declare so, the implications would, in my view, be very grave, and therefore, by dint of the doctrine of necessity, you legalize what they did, because otherwise all the activities that they have been engaged in would have been declared illegal, and perhaps Parliament would have very quickly tried to enact a piece of legislation to give them an after-the-fact legal validity. But that, I think, is something that did not happen, and I think they got it right. The other thing that I think they got right, I do not believe that there are any clauses in any constitution called eternal clauses. It will suggest that if you have a constitution, there are certain clauses that can never be amended. Those of you who are students of constitutional theory will know it is normally argued that the longest long-serving constitution in the world is the Constitution of San Marino, which was made in the year 1600, debatable. I want to believe that there were other unwritten constitutions, but even such constitutions are subject to amendment. That, I think, they got it right. I begin to disagree with them when they say that our Constitution does not have a basic structure. I believe it does. I believe that the basic structure of the Kenyan Constitution is actually spelled out in the Constitution itself. They must not do what the Indians did, because when the Indians were talking about the basic structure, there was certain lacuna, if you may, in the Constitution. The Constitution may have been silent about certain things, but the Kenyan Constitution 2010 sets out in black and white, which I think, certain things which I think can actually be baptized as the basic structure. And that, I think, is something, and Dr. Juang did speak about it. I think in this regard, the jurisprudence as articulated by Justice Ibrahim will, in the next few years, be the dominant jurisprudence and not the finding of the majority. I also refuse to believe that issues such as the basic structure belong to university rarefied air of the university classrooms. There is a nexus between what is at the university and what is applied on the ground. And one day, some of the judges who did not think like I do, I believe, on their journey from the legal, on their journey to Damascus, they'll see light, and they will see and think like us on that particular issue. I also believe that there are certain things that are preserved for certain bodies in the Constitution, and that therefore, in a nutshell, without belaboring the point, I want to conclude by telling us that given our long history, and I've traced our history from the British Settlement Act of 1887, I've taken you through our orders in council in 1897, I've taken you through the order in council of 1902, 1905, I've taken you through the order in council of 1920, I've taken you the Kenya Colony order in council of 1921, I've taken you through the Littleton Constitution, the Lennox-Boyd Constitution of 1958. I've taken you through Act number 1968 of 1963. I've also taken you through Act number 5 of 1969, and I've ended taking you through a short history of the process of constitution making, and culminating in my discussion of the 2010 Constitution and isolating for discussion Articles number 255, Article number 256, and Article number 257, and demonstrating that indeed the path of constitutional amendment is now well laid, and that the courts have now had the opportunity of pronouncing themselves on the issue, and is now quite clear to me that indeed our Constitution can only be amended in a manner that is in fidelity to our own prescriptions, and it cannot be amended by the whims of men. and that is a good place to be in. But ultimately, we must be the guardians of our own constitution. Kenya is a young country. It will become the age 59 later this year, and such a country still needs to be nurtured. It's still a country in diapers, and we will change the diapers as the country soils herself, but change them we will in accordance with the Constitution. Thank you very much.
All right, come up with it. Asante, asante sana. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Our Constitution and our constitutional professors. It's a good day to be in Kenya. We are proud of this Constitution, of what Wanjiku could do. It came from Moi when he said, what does Wanjiku know about Constitution? And that has become a word of dissent and protest when people say, we are Wanjiku. It was actually a way Moi was saying, what does ordinary person knows about the Constitution? Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. And all our guests. One person asked me a question and told me, now without basic structure, Dr. Juang, does it mean if I come with a popular initiative and delete everything in the Constitution and write the word, this Constitution shall stand amended, and go collect the signatures and take it through referendum, will you consider that an amendment? And I said, unfortunately, from the Supreme Court ruling, that will be what? An amendment. Delete everything in the Constitution, write few words, this Constitution of 2022 or of 2010 remains amended, and follow the steps they were saying. Without basic structure, that will be an amendment. And that is the breadth of how broad, without basic structure, people can go. Because as professors have pointed to us, the politicians were more or else responsible for our delayed constitution. And usually they are not the solution. Most of the time they are the problem. And so it becomes suspicious when they again become the solution. And so our Constitution protects itself from the Constitution, from the cold that is not made by Wanjiku. I want to thank you. We are going to give our gifts and a small token. Then we will have Professor Reed again thank the student. We have in this hall 400 bodies who have attended today. We have online another bigger crowd than this, and that is a testimony that people are seeking knowledge. Okay, so I will, Professor, I've requested that we should entertain at least 2 questions. Dr. Boyo will preside over that. I want to call very briefly Mercy Wanjiru Kibuthu to say hi to us. She's also a student who have done a lot of legal clinic. She will share with us briefly her experience. Then we will get questions. 2 or 3, there is grace in the house of the Lord. This, by the way, is a chapel, and so we are very aware of the avenue of grace. So Ms. Mercy, come, and then our VC, our DVC, thank you very much. You will give us prayer and blessing and thank our guests and bless them for us. Mercy, karibu.
Thank you, Dr. John. Good evening. I'm Master Wanjiro, a former KSL student. Yes, I'm Master Wanjiro and a former KSL student. I'm also a lawyer. And as my senior and professor always tells us, it's incumbent upon us to volunteer as much as we can to imitate those who came before us. And as such, I've done a little volunteer work in different parts of Kenya and in Nigeria and other places in my undergrad. And one thing that I've noticed is that we cannot talk about the right to access to justice without information. I'll briefly talk about a case I did a legal research on, and it was in Kigongo Maximum Prison, where one young man, I wish I'd brought the book, was incarcerated, was sentenced to life. And his only mistake was that, my research was based on people, epileptic people, and how, some of the symptoms are anger, frustration, and aggressiveness. So this one time he was in the shamba or garden with a machete, and he got to a confrontation with the father, and the father wanted to show him who is the man. And so he went to the chief, reported him to teach him a lesson. His father did not have information of what that means. And that's why we come in a role as legal students, legal scholars. That's why volunteer work and legal aid is important. So the father went to the chief called the police. On the charge sheet, the police wrote that the father claimed that this young man had taken a machete, threatened him, and took 1,000 shillings from him. So instead of the police giving information to this chief and the father, he wrote that it was robbery with violence, which attracts a really hefty sentence. And when the father had that, when the judge read out the sentence, the father almost collapsed, and he was actually helping us, working on the appeal, because they never had legal representation. He could not have been given such a sentence had the father not had enough knowledge to know that threatening someone with a panga and taking money from them, that's robbery with violence. So that's why I support what Professor Lumumba talks about. We have a responsibility as legal, especially right now as a former student personally. I know the importance of taking your time during even breaks. I mean, I have gone to places whereby people had no idea what the legal recourse is after something has happened. You have that information, but you're not normally taught that you have to wait until you graduate or until you're admitted for us to be useful. So I'd like to encourage you to really take time and spread this information. You have the responsibility to do so. It's incumbent upon you as a legal scholar, as a legal student, to do so. I was given just some time to say hello, and thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Mercy. We really appreciate. Another round of applause. Thank you. That is why today we are launching our new clinic aid, and we really appreciate that. Professor PLO asked us or gave us an opportunity for 2 questions. Dr. Ojwang tried an amendment. I think there is a basic structure here. I may want to stick to 2 questions. Yeah. So I want to do that very fast. There's a mic that is with us here. Just raise your hand up, and you'll be able to. Okay. The first one was here. I'll start with this one. Buto. Okay. Let's do that very fast. We have Dr. Hamala asking a question, and then there's one more. I want to pick one more. You'll allow me to do a lady so that I'm able to make sure that we have good representation. There's a lady there. So, Buto, if you can do that very fast, we pick those two questions, and then I'll call Prof to speak to them, and then we could proceed from there. We can start with Doc, then you can respond to them once. Thank you. Dr. Hamala, and then there's a lady behind there. Yeah, thank you. And then you'll be able to call Prof to speak to them.
Thank you, the organizers, my dean and the law faculty. Full disclosure, Professor Lumumba was my dean at Kabarak University, so it's more like whatever he says is binding on me. So mine is simply to seek clarification rather than contest the words of wisdom that we have benefited from. I want to thank you for the erudite illumination of the historical journey that we have taken. I guess the essence of my curiosity has to do with, take for example the US Constitution that's not being amended. You mentioned San Marino, but all the new realities that emerge in the society are simply recast depending on the composition of the justices, whether liberal or conservative, in order to suit the changing times without the necessity of Congress having to hammer out a new document. The United Kingdom, which bequeathed us Westminster, doesn't have a written constitution. Yet, in the hearts and minds of men and women, there is a 5-year-old will say that those are not our values, because there is the British gentleman. So that when we speak of Wanjiku, my question really goes, I would like to think that there is an essence of basic structure. Individual on the ground. PLO has said in many discussions, he's a politician, but we lack political hygiene, which would suggest that the men and women on the ground don't vote with respect to a Kenyanness and the Kenyan identity that we like to think is there. So in many ways, and to conclude, although independence came in 1963, there was a sense in which the United Nations and the international community outlawed colonialism. And that outlawing of Declaration of 1960 from the international community made it untenable for there to be colonialism. And so we receive nationhood when we don't have the effective capacity to be a republic. We can't collect the taxes, we don't have the economic stability. So there's a sense in which we have been fledgling with our claim to legitimacy. Yes, we are ruled by Africans, but by 1990, we are more fascinated by legality, more than even that legitimacy. And by 2007, we are more fascinated. I'm worried about the fascination with the written document other than the practices. Every time I come in the matatu, there is a bribe that must be given to the policeman. Whether I was at Kabarak going up that direction, whether I'm coming to Rongai, that is the constitution. And there is another unwritten constitution that people mention about deep state, that nothing can ever happen that is transparent because there are demons behind the scenes and there are only certain people who must preside over others. So I wanted Professor Lumumba to maybe enlighten us on, apart from the document in the positivist sense, and the reality of what does it mean to be a Kenyan and what would Kenyans actually die for, and say, okay, then I'm going to emigrate if this is not part of the republic. Is there that is the basic structure that you can identify? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kamala. Let's pick that second question. Make it fast and straight to the point so that we can have time to respond.
Okay, I'll get right directly to my question. At some point, Professor, you mentioned homegrown solutions for African countries post-independence, the conversation of us coming up with policies and ideas that are homegrown for us, solutions by us for us. Now, fast forward to the conversations we're having right now, questions of constitutional amendments or cutting colonial ties and all those solutions surrounding Africa in the 21st century, if I can say so. We cannot possibly go about these conversations without acknowledging the fact that they are primarily founded in the concept of public policy design, because everything is founded in public policy. But then there's an argument, debatable however, that is going around that there is this huge gap between policy design and the actual implementation. So my question is in two parts. Do you think that this gap between design and implementation is a big problem? And if your answer is in the positive, what exactly is at the core of this issue? Because we'll talk of corruption, we'll talk of colonial ties and all those, but I personally believe those are the symptoms, and we need to identify what exactly is causing this gap. And yeah, if you could answer that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you very much for. I'll start with the last question. If you have read Chinua Achebe's little book, written in 1983, The Trouble with Nigeria, he says that the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a problem of leadership. And then he proceeds to say that the problem with Nigeria is that Nigeria is a geographical fiction. That could be said of many countries, that these are fictions. And I think it's Nyerere who explained it very well in 1966, that when we talk of Tanganyika, he said that, it is not the same way as a Swedish would talk of Sweden, or a Finn would talk of Finland, or a Dane would talk of Denmark. And I said this during my presentation, The Curse of Berlin. So you find yourself in the territory we call Kenya, which has nearly over 50 nations in their own right, within this legal fiction called Kenya, trying to create a state. And you can see, therefore, that when we articulate policy positions, we do policy formulation in the same way as they would be formulated in your typical European state. But look at the making of the European state over the years. Most European states are nation states. If it is Sweden, they are Swedish, except with a small Sami population, the Lapps. If it is Finland, they are Finns, except with a small population of the Swedes. If it is Norway, they are Norwegians. But wherever Europe has a multiplicity of nations, they have a problem. Spain, for example, has 17 regions. And until very recently, during your lifetime and my lifetime, you remember the story of the Basques separatists. And it's only when the Basque problem was sorted out that the Basque created or have their own territory called the Basque country. And the Basque country collects, for example, 100% of the taxes and remits 17% to the Madrid government for defense and foreign affairs. Why am I telling you this? I think many African countries are still grappling with the question of governance. We are still at an experimental stage. That is why our constitutions are still very unstable. Power is still very personalized, and our approach to things is still very patrimonial. And the BBI is a perfect example that two individuals can meet and make a claim that they have a sudden Damascus enlightenment. And they say, because we have thought about this, about the nation called Kenya, if the Kenyans implement it, it will save Kenya. And then look at even what we are now implementing at the Political Parties Act. One of the things that we said we would do when we were enacting the Constitution is that we would have political parties with a national character, so that a political party with a national character would have offices in at least 24 of the counties. See the amendment to the Political Parties Act. It has enabled the political class to cobble something called coalition of parties, so that we now have political parties which are now clan-based. In the political arena, you see that. And the problem, therefore, is, although we talk of Wanjiku, the relationship between Wanjiku and policy formulation and the political and the constitutional making is still a very remote one. The first allegiance, even in Kenya, is allegiance to the tribe and allegiance to the tribal leader. And when you are in such a situation, who is it who said it? It was said in Nigeria in 1967 that when one of the leading politicians, Nnamdi Azikiwe, thought that he had captured the spirit of the Nigerian nation and he thought he was singing a Nigerian song, he thought that every Nigerian would follow him. But when he looked back, it is only the Igbo who are following him. And when Awolowo looked back, it is only the Yoruba who are following him. And he says, it is not the song that matters, but who is singing the song. And that is also true in Kenya. It is not the song that matters. If you look at Kenya, for example, if any of these leading politicians were to move from party A to party B, the bulk of people from their tribe would also immediately become members of party B. Notwithstanding that the new political amendment says that a political party shall have a discernible ideology or a program of action. It is not the ideology that they follow, it is not the program that they follow, but they follow their anointed ethnic leader. When you are in such a situation in a pre-industrial society, essentially, then the gap between policy formulation and the reality on the ground is not is very big. And it doesn't matter whether you've gone to school. This is what I've discovered. It doesn't matter. In these matters, the professor and the fisherman and the professor and the herdsman speak the same language. One may speak in English and the other in mother tongue, but they say the same thing. And that is the problem of Africa as we speak. So you'll find it in many things. And it is not your generation that will see the changes. It's not my generation. It will take a long time. It is a process of growth. Tanzania appeared to succeed in it because of the charisma and the selflessness of Nyerere. But Kenya did not achieve it, because Kenya, immediately after independence, playing the ethnic card became the way in which you maneuvered and the way in which you conducted politics. And ethnic suspicion is still very useful in Kenyan politics. I invite you to read Koigi wa Wamwere's Towards Genocide in Kenya, the Curse of Negative Ethnicity, in order to understand how that is manipulated and how that is done. The second question is by Dr. Hamala. I am normally very worried when people make a comparison between the Constitution of the United States of America and the Kenyan Constitution. Because if you look at the American Declaration of Independence, 1776, the founding fathers of the United States of America were quite clear as to why they were constituting government. We hold this truth to be self-evident. And they say, that all men are born equal, they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. And he says that is for this reason, governments are instituted amongst men to do the following things. And then they begin to narrate how the British monarch had misbehaved and how, therefore, they are forming government. Your typical post-colonial state was not created out of deliberate effort. The people are welded together. And therefore, they found themselves in territories. And when they found, and in fact, I always say that the post-colonial African state was actually designed to fail. And that therefore, the seeds of our destruction were planted within it. Which then tells you, therefore, that when the Americans were meeting to make their constitution, the 1787 constitution ratified in 1788, that constitution, they came, first of all, the 13 original states came to perfect the union. That is what they say. They came to perfect the union. In other words, the commonwealths existed in their own right. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts in its own right, the Commonwealth in their own right, complete with their constitution. And that is why the American federal constitution must never be confused with our constitutions, which are unitary. It was deliberately designed, and you remember the first 10 amendments really could have been printed with the original constitution, but for historical reasons that you know about. But the most important thing is that the federal constitution is not up for scrutiny unless it defines the federal issues. The American Constitution has now been amended 27 times. I think the last amendment of the American Constitution was in 1992 to deal with the remuneration of congressmen and congresswomen. And you can see deliberately that you cannot deal with it in the manner that we deal with the Constitution of Kenya. African constitutions tend to be detailed almost as if they were pieces of legislation, because you don't want to leave things to chance. You don't want to leave it to interpretation. You want them to be black and white, so that even when the courts are called upon to interpret those provisions, they have very little room for maneuver, and therefore they are confined. And the reason is very simple. They are mediating things which are not issues in many of those states. And you have seen states collapse. Allow me, states can collapse even when there is a clear constitutional dispensation. In our own lifetime, we have seen Yugoslavia collapse. In our own lifetime, we have seen the Soviet Union collapse and producing over 10 countries. In our own lifetime, we have seen the creation of South Sudan. In our own lifetime in Africa, we see the agitation in Nigeria of Biafra and attempt at secession in Biafra. In our own lifetime, we are seeing Tigray. In our own lifetime, we are seeing Somaliland trying to depart from Somali. So I want to conclude by saying the African constitution, by its very nature, is a constitution which is designed to mediate things which would not ordinarily be mediated in a constitution when you are dealing with a federal state. And the American federal constitution, as I've said, of 1787, must therefore be mentioned very reluctantly when we are comparing it with the Kenyan constitution. The Swiss constitution also is another constitution that I see many of us mentioning and comparing with the Kenyan constitution, and I discourage it. The Switzerland constitution of 1874, which is confederal, a very weak center because the cantons are stronger. So when we are dealing with our constitution, remember I said, half in jest, half in seriousness, that we are still young countries in diapers. We'll soil ourselves. This constitution's efficacy and success will only be tested when all its makers are dead. We are still talking about a constitution whose makers are still alive. They still want to say, we forgot to include this, we want to include it now. In 100 years' time, when they are all dead, there'll be a much more objective assessment by successive generations when they'll be able to say, this Constitution must mean this for our times. And I think if you look at the Constitution as a living document in that regard, then you are able to appreciate that a Constitution is not something that is fossilized in time, set in stone. It is living. And the American Constitution, I've always told people who care to listen, that remember that the American Constitution, which declared all men to have been born equal, or the Declaration of Independence, that until 1963, persons of color did not have the right to vote in places like Alabama. So which men, even when they were saying all men are born equal, did not include women. And even when they included women, it did not include persons of color. But over the years, new words acquire a new penumbra of meaning. And that penumbra of meaning can only be defined by context and time. And that is how I want us to look at the Constitution. And that is why I think that our constitutions must then be allowed to grow and breathe. I personally was very afraid to have a constitution that provides everything, but I was persuaded in these dangerously diverse nations, there are certain things that cannot be left to interpretation. They must be defined, and sometimes defined in a manner that is restrictive, is defined to mean not to include. Because even when you say to include, people will include things that you never imagined. But you know that what you are asking me to answer in a few minutes is what we could spend a whole semester teaching. So accept my answer in its form. Thank you.